The Young and the Restless Spoilers. It began with whispers, the kind of whispers that drift like cold air through the cracks of Genoa City's most powerful walls, soft enough to ignore at first, but persistent enough to make the strongest families feel the tremor beneath their feet. What no one could have anticipated was how quickly those whispers would grow into something darker, something venomous, something carrying the stench of a past that everyone believed had been buried decades ago. Matt Clark, once thought to be nothing more than a chapter of painful history, was suddenly back, but not in any form the Newmans or anyone else could have predicted. He was different now, colder, sharper, a ghost wearing a stranger's face, a presence that no longer lingered in the shadows but moved like a calculating storm with one objective carved into the darkest corners of his mind: retaliation. And it was not just revenge for the old wounds, not just a bitter echo of the rivalry with Nick or the grudges once held. This was something deeper, something broken inside of him, something twisted into a hunger to dismantle everyone who carried the Newman name, beginning with their youngest and most vulnerable. Noah's disappearance was the first crack in their world, a crack so small at first that some dared to hope it was just a misunderstanding, a detour, a moment of silence waiting to be resolved. But it wasn't. It was the opening move in a war none of them saw coming. The terror grew when Nikki became the next to vanish, ripped away from the safety of her home, from Victor's protection, from the influence of generations of Newman power. When she awoke, she found herself not in some damp, cold basement, not in a cage or some grotesque dungeon. No, Nikki found herself in a room far too clean, far too deliberately arranged, a place where every detail had been chosen with unsettling precision. She felt the faint sting on her arm from whatever sedative had been used, but instead of fear overtaking her, something surprising rose within her. A steadiness, a clarity that came from decades of surviving crises, from clawing her way out of addiction and heartbreak and enemies that had tried to break her spirit. She sat up slowly, her breath tight but stable, refusing to give her captor the satisfaction of seeing her panic. Yet even in that moment of strength, she faced the one reality she was unprepared for: she had no idea who had done this to her. The figure she had glimpsed before everything went dark wasn't a face she recognized. Nothing about him fit the Matt Clark she remembered, nothing except for the darkness in his eyes. Victor, meanwhile, felt the familiar fire rising inside him, a fire sharpened by desperation and rage. Losing Nikki, even for a moment, was something he couldn't accept, something that turned his heartbeat into a war drum. Only Victor Newman would be able to piece together the truth quickly enough to matter. And he did. He was the first to see through the altered face, the reconstructed identity, the new persona wrapped in the cold mask of a man reborn through bitterness. He recognized what no one else could: beneath that new appearance, beneath the surgically altered cold smile, beneath the eerie calm, there was only one man capable of orchestrating such a precise, merciless assault on the Newman family. Matt Clark. Not dead, not gone, not changed in any meaningful way except for the external shell. He had evolved into something more dangerous, someone willing to remake himself completely just for the chance to hurt Victor where it mattered most. But the question that burned hottest, the one Victor couldn't shake even as he confirmed Matt's involvement, was how he managed it. Matt was cunning, yes, but not omnipotent. Taking Noah, snatching Nikki, orchestrating the moves with such frightening precision, this wasn't something he could accomplish alone. Victor knew enough about the history of his enemies to understand when a second hand was lifting the knife with him. Someone who knew the Newman family intimately. Someone with a taste for chaos. Someone who carried her grudges like trophies. Someone whose hatred had matured into something elegant and poisonous. There was only one answer, one that chilled him more than the return of Matt Clark himself: Phyllis. Not the version of her that tried so desperately to pretend she had changed. Not the woman who claimed she wanted redemption. No, this was the Phyllis who thrived on destruction, the Phyllis who delighted in turning love into ash, the Phyllis who wanted not just to win but to watch her enemies crumble under the weight of their own fear. The version of Phyllis that people whispered about but never confronted directly. The Phyllis who, in the eyes of many, had always been a mutation of her own worst instincts. Her involvement became clearer as the pieces fell into place. The subtle digital footprints, the suspicious phone pings, the unmistakable precision behind the traps being laid, none of it had Matt's signature, not even the new Matt with his surgically sculpted identity. It had hers. It was her mind, her venom, her talent for manipulating cracks in relationships until they became fractures. She didn't have to physically take Nikki. She only had to point Matt in the right direction, feed him the information he needed, unlock the doors that were supposed to protect the Newman family. Some might argue that Phyllis hated Diane or Sharon more than she hated Nikki or Victor, but destruction rarely travels in straight lines. In her mind, the Newmans had always played a role in humiliating her, rejecting her, questioning her sanity, undermining her sense of power. And so she aligned herself with a monster, not because she believed in his cause, but because she believed in his ability to create fear, and fear was the one thing she felt the Newmans had never truly experienced enough of. While Nikki fought to remain steady in captivity, while Noah's fate hovered in a dreadful silence, while Victor pieced together the horrors unfolding around him, Phyllis lingered in the shadows of guilt she refused to acknowledge, letting Matt take the fall for the physical crimes while she quietly orchestrated the psychological warfare. She was no longer the fiery, impulsive woman driven by reckless emotion. This version of Phyllis was calculating, methodical, driven by an impulse to make every person she resented feel small, powerless, and terrified. She had become a kind of mutation, a distorted evolution of the woman she once was. Even her closest allies couldn't recognize her motivations anymore, because she no longer cared for loyalty or consequences, only impact. As Matt tightened his grip around Nikki's captivity, testing her strength and waiting for the perfect moment to strike at Victor's soul, Phyllis worked her angles from the outside, ensuring that the clues Victor found would always be one step behind, ensuring the fear had time to bloom, ensuring that the safety of the Newman family felt just out of reach. And yet, despite everything, Nikki refused to crumble. She held on to her memories of battles won, addictions defeated, marriages rebuilt, and children raised with fierce determination. She wouldn't give Matt the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. And she certainly wouldn't give Phyllis the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed. The terror of the situation didn't lie in the violence, it lay in the psychology of betrayal. Matt was a monster acting on vengeance, but Phyllis was something more dangerous. A human being choosing darkness with full clarity, helping to dismantle the life she had always wanted to belong to but never truly believed she could. Her actions weren't born out of desperation, they were born out of choice. A choice to align herself with someone unhinged. A choice to harm people who had welcomed her, trusted her, forgiven her time and time again. A choice to stand beside chaos because it made her feel powerful. Victor knew the storm had only begun. And Nikki, though strong, understood she was trapped in the crosshairs of a plan designed by two people who thrived on devastation. Noah remained missing, his silence becoming a wound none of them knew how to soothe. And Genoa City remained unaware that the nightmare unfolding around them had been crafted not by one enemy wearing a stolen face, but by two, one reborn into madness, and one who had chosen, willingly and deliberately, to let madness become her reflection. But the true terror of Matt and Phyllis's alliance wasn't revealed until the fractures in Genoa City began to deepen in subtle, almost invisible ways. It started with whispers among those closest to the Newmans. The unease in Nick's voice when he noticed inconsistencies in the timeline of Nikki's disappearance, the way Sharon felt a chill every time she stepped into the empty house Noah should have been in, the quiet dread that settled into Victoria's posture whenever she caught a glimpse of security footage that didn't quite add up. It was as if the air itself was shifting around them, tightening, pressing them toward a truth too monstrous to name out loud. The Newmans were used to enemies emerging from the shadows, but never had they faced one who had altered their face, their identity, their very existence in order to infiltrate their lives. And never had they imagined that someone who once shared their table, their holidays, their fragile trust would be the architect behind the chaos tearing them apart. As Victor delved deeper into the patterns behind the attacks, He began to notice that Matt's actions carried a blueprint far more sophisticated than the impulsive, vengeance-driven crimes of the past. There was a rhythm to the madness, a structure hidden beneath the violence, and that structure bore the unmistakable signature of someone who understood not just how to injure the Newmans, but how to psychologically dismantle them. Phyllis had always been a woman fueled by fire. Sometimes too much fire, but this version of her was a chilling evolution, someone who had shed her humanity like a snake discarding its skin, revealing a cold-blooded strategist beneath. The disappearance of Noah was not random, it was surgical. Matt may have physically taken him, but it was Phyllis who mapped out his routines, who identified the gaps in security, who predicted the exact moment when Noah would be alone, vulnerable, out of sight but not out of reach. She knew the Newman family patterns better than most of them did. She had watched them for years, been inside their walls, observed the dynamics, the weaknesses, the fractures in their bonds. And now she was weaponizing every ounce of that knowledge with a calmness that bordered on monstrous. Meanwhile, Nikki tried to steady her breathing in that sterile room, forcing her mind to stay sharp even as her body trembled from the lingering effects of the drugs. She refused to let fear consume her. She replayed every detail she could remember, the faint scent of the person who grabbed her, the strange temperature of the room, the muffled footsteps outside her door. She didn't know yet that the man who took her wasn't someone she would recognize by sight, not anymore. Matt had changed not only his appearance but his entire presence. He was no longer a face from the past. He was a phantom who had carved himself a new identity, making him untraceable to anyone except Victor, who had looked into enough eyes filled with hatred throughout his lifetime to recognize the darkness staring back at him, no matter what mask it wore. But the deeper Victor pushed into the investigation, the more he found himself confronting an enemy he had long underestimated, Phyllis. He had tolerated her, forgiven her, even grudgingly admired her at times, but he had never truly trusted her. He knew she carried jealousy like a disease, obsession like a shadow, impulsiveness like a weapon. But he had not anticipated the shift from impulsive recklessness to calculated conspiracy. The evidence was undeniable. Private server logs that pointed to remote access into Newman security feeds, mysterious encrypted communications routed from a device registered under one of Phyllis's shell companies. The pattern of misinformation fed to the police that only someone with intimate family knowledge could have planted. Every step led back to her, weaving her name into the fabric of this nightmare with chilling clarity. Meanwhile, Sharon began to feel the tremor of a deeper fear each day Noah remained missing. She would sit at the edge of her couch at night, staring at the front door as if willing it to open, convincing herself she would hear his footsteps, his voice, something, anything. But deep down, she felt the truth tugging at her consciousness like a cold hand. Noah was not missing. Noah had been taken. And someone had planned it with precision. At the Abbott house, Jack sensed something darker brewing beneath the surface of the town, and though he didn't yet know the details, he recognized the feeling of a storm that could sweep them all into its path. He had seen too many battles between the Abbotts and Newmans to mistake the signs. Kyle, still reeling from his own dramas, felt a creeping anxiety he couldn't explain, a sensation that Claire's nervous glances and Harrison's sudden clinginess seemed to amplify. Even Diane, despite her hard exterior, felt something heavy in the air, something cold enough to make her glance over her shoulder more often than usual. But none of them knew yet that all roads led back to a single poisonous route, and that route was Phyllis, whose darkness had blended so seamlessly with Matt's that the two had become a single force of destruction. As Nikki attempted to steel herself against the terror of her captivity, she found moments of clarity that allowed her to piece together fragments of the truth. She could hear Matt's voice through the door sometimes, distorted, unfamiliar, but occasionally slipping into old patterns, the cadence of a man whose hatred had fermented over decades, thick and intoxicating. And there were moments where she sensed a second presence. A person who moved differently, someone quieter, someone whose footsteps carried calculation instead of brute force. Little did she know that Phyllis herself had stood just outside that room more than once, watching through the crack of the door, savoring the sight of a world beginning to collapse around her. But Phyllis wasn't careless. She ensured she left no trace, no scent, no shadow. Her involvement was a ghost's whisper, a knife held behind a curtain, a presence felt but never confirmed. Meanwhile, Victor was transforming into the version of himself that the world feared most, not the businessman, not the patriarch, but the warrior forged through betrayal, loss, and blood. He wasn't just searching for Nikki, he was hunting, stalking every potential lead, digging through digital trails, interrogating anyone remotely suspicious. And as the truth crystallized, the involvement of Matt, the digital fingerprints of Phyllis, the terrifying silence surrounding Noah. Something shifted inside him. This wasn't just an attack on his family. It was an assault on his legacy, his very identity, a challenge from two people who believed they could break the unbreakable. But Victor Newman was not a man who broke. He was a man who destroyed anyone foolish enough to threaten what he built. In a hidden corner of Genoa City, Noah remained trapped in a space designed not for torture but for psychological erosion. Matt visited him like a specter, speaking in riddles, taunting him with fragments of truths twisted into illusions. Noah tried to stay strong, but the darkness of isolation pressed on him like a weight, each hour stretching into something unbearable. He didn't know yet that Nikki was somewhere in the same nightmare, or that the hands orchestrating his suffering did not belong solely to the man standing in front of him. And as all of this unfolded, Phyllis lingered in the heart of Genoa City as though nothing were amiss, smiling, manipulating conversations, planting seeds of doubt, playing the innocent while her mind churned with the thrill of chaos. She watched the panic grow around her, watched the Newmans scramble for answers, and felt something dangerous blooming in the hollow parts of her soul, satisfaction. Because this time, she wasn't reacting to pain. She was creating it. But what neither she nor Matt anticipated was that the very foundation they sought to break was built by survivors, people who had crawled through hell and risen again and again. Nikki's strength was not just emotional, it was ancestral, woven into her bones. Victor's rage was not reckless, it was precise, calculated, lethal when provoked. Sharon's intuition was not weak, it was razor-sharp when her children were threatened. And the Abbotts, though not direct targets yet, would not stand idle once the truth surfaced. Genoa City was quietly transforming into a battlefield, even if its residents didn't know it yet. And the war Matt and Phyllis had ignited would soon spiral beyond their control. Because when the Newmans fought back, they didn't fight to survive, they fought to obliterate anyone who dared touch their family.